to my studio. Today I thought it would be interesting for at least some of you if I talk you through my process of drawing up a quilt pattern. I do get questions about this quite a bit, and I know that there are some of you that would love to take a class on this. I'm not there yet, but here's a little adventure into explaining that process to you. So I hope that for those of you who are interested in that this is a helpful exercise. I always start in my sketchbook. I always start with lots of sketches. As I'm sketching, my brain is processing my ideas for a new artwork, sometimes subconsciously. So I'll do pages and pages of sketches on my subject material. And then I'm also starting to think about the composition of my quilt. And that's where I'll do quick thumbnail sketches to just kind of work out which composition am I favouring the most. So for today's drawing exercise, I'm looking at a bird quilt. I've had a lot of requests for a pattern featuring birds, and I'm testing that for myself in my drawing process for now. We'll see whether it develops into a pattern. I'm not promising anything yet. So what I've done is I've gone through and gone into my sketchbooks. I've actually looked back at previous drawings of magpies that I've done. If you follow me online, you'll know I've released a magpie collection previously and have featured magpies in some of my artworks recently. So I'm going to focus on magpies, and I'm doing a bunch of magpie sketches in my sketchbook, particularly flying magpies in flight. Bird flight in particular is something that I'd like to try to capture in some artworks. I've already had a go at that, and I'd like to tackle that again still. So I am going to focus on magpies in flight. So I'm going to do a bunch of sketches in my sketchbook, and then I'm going to work with those sketches to create my quilt design. So I'm also playing around with some thumbnails. I've drawn up a few really quick sketches of how I might like to lay out the birds in my design. From here, I actually find it most helpful to take the work from my sketchbooks onto my iPad. So I take a bunch of photos of my drawings and put them onto my iPad, and then I work digitally in my Procreate app. I never used to use an iPad or Procreate or any of that. I used to do this by photocopying or tracing my drawings or redrawing them as required. So don't stress if you don't have an iPad. Will just show you the process that I use, and you can adapt it to whatever means that you have at home. So I import the photos of my sketches into Procreate, and the good thing there is that I can work in layers, so I can enlarge or decrease the size of each drawing as I see fit, without having to mess with the photocopier. That's the beauty of working digitally. So I'm trying some different layers of birds on this drawing, trying to arrange the flying birds in a composition that I think is aesthetically pleasing, and one that I want it to have a sense of movement, because that's why I'm trying to capture bird flight, is to capture a sense of movement and life. So playing with the orientation and the size of the different birds has allowed me to get to a composition that I'm pretty happy with. There's the composition, 3 birds. I would love to do lots more birds, but there's a fair bit of piecing in just 1 bird. So I'm going to keep it to 3 for now so that hopefully the quilt is not too complicated. So the next thing I need to do is take my sketches and actually draw a quilt pattern that I can use to sew a quilt from. So a sketch is one thing, but I need to draw every single seam line. So I need to demarcate every single quilt piece in order to be able to sew this quilt. I go into a new layer in my drawing, or if you're doing it on paper, you overlay your original drawing with tracing paper. And then I'm just going to trace over my sketch, and I'm going to think very carefully about my seam lines. So with piecework, with any kind of patchwork, piecing together pieces of fabric, you're working in blocks of colour. If I compare it to stained glass window, I think you would all know what I mean. Each piece of glass there is one distinct colour, just like each quilt piece is one distinct colour. So anywhere I draw a line now on my quilt pattern, that is a seam line, and that is where I can change from one colour to the next. So as I'm tracing this sketch, it's all about where does the colour change, and that's where I'll put a seam line. And then each piece on my drawing will be one solid colour of fabric. Obviously, you can play with fabric that's got variations of colour across it, and you can really get quite creative with that. That's not something I use in my artwork. So when I'm drawing, I'm really thinking about solid blocks of colour, and that's what I'm going to demonstrate. So this drawing is it's a rough pencil sketch, and it's got a lot of those sketchy lines. I could go and colour this now and then draw my pattern from my colour design, but I'm going to just stick with my pencil sketch, and I want to keep some of those lines, those pencil lines, as actual pieces of fabric. And then I'm also going to think a little bit about colour, and I'm just going to work that out as I go. So some of the pencil lines will show up as black or charcoal pieces of fabric in the final quilt. Sometimes I'm going to just use that pencil line as the demarcation between one colour and another. So in this case, I'm tracing around the charcoal pencil line, and that's going to become a long skinny piece of fabric in the finished quilt. I want to capture the sense of feathers here, so I'm going to actually add seam lines that you can't see. This is partly about knowing your subject matter, so that I'm going to continue through to there, and then I'll finish off that feather with another skinny line. I could choose to leave out those 2 lines and just make this just one solid block of colour, but I quite like the challenge of some extra line work in there. And then this one up to there. Part of the reason why I'm having to work this out as I go along is because I'm working from a really rough sketch. If your sketch is tidier than this, then this process will be much tidier as well. Oh, lost that one. So as you're drawing up your quilt pattern, you do need to think about what your sewing skills are like. So that'll determine how many pieces you're going to include and how small those pieces are or how detailed they are. And I also always think about the curves that I'm creating. So I'm creating quite a few curves in these feathers. What I don't want to do is, if I just remove that layer and show you here, what I want to avoid is a line that looks like this, because that requires sewing around a really tight curve when there's no need to. Just zoom in a little bit there. So I've just added a line to just demonstrate that's a really tight curve. If I end up with a curve like that, one option I have is to actually add a line straight through the middle, and I call that a construction seam. So the purpose of that is then I will stitch those sides together and those sides together. So that's a manageable curve and this is a manageable curve. Once they're stitched together, this is also a manageable curve. Compare that with the original curve, which is quite unmanageable. So just adding that construction seam down the centre made that a much more manageable thing to sew. And you can either choose different colours on each side, or if you do the same colour on either side, you won't even see the seam in the finished quilt. I mean, you will be able to see it, but it's not something that your eye will look at. So that's why I call it a construction seam. The other option that you have is what I did here, which is I made a smooth seam on one side and then the curve on the other side of the feather. So rather than one continuous very tight curve, we have one gentle curve and another another fairly reasonable curve as well. So two seams instead of one, but both of them are much more manageable than the original tight curve. So we keep drawing up the quilt design in this manner. I'll often leave a line hanging like that and come back to it later when my drawing is finished, when I can kind of work out where to end it. So for now, I'll just leave it there. So here, I'm not going to actually trace the pencil line. I'm just going to use that pencil line to demarcate between two different colours. So this is a white patch on the magpie's wing, and this will be dark, like black or near black. So just a single line there rather than a double line. But I am on the other side going to add a few extra seam lines, and although I can quite comfortably show the change from black to white here without adding the extra lines, this will be a fun opportunity to just add in some colour highlights. Like I'll probably make that blue or a bit of yellow just to add some interest to the quilt design. Here's a spot that I should talk about a little bit as well. Just like I spoke about the tight curves over here, we also want to avoid sharp corners. So if I had just drawn this feather with a pointy line like that, that would mean that you would need to piece it by stitching around a sharp corner. And that's something I never do in my quilts. I never piece around a corner. I always only piece straight lines or gentle manageable curves. So that's why I actually took the original line that I drew and kept it going, and then started a new seam there and went that way. So now once I've stitched that to these pieces, there's just a gentle seam to piece and not a tight curve. The same would apply if you're drawing leaves or anything, even a right angle. I never stitch around a corner. I always add in, this section here would be a construction seam again. So I always add in a construction seam just to make that more manageable. I want to just draw attention to the eye. So there's the pupil, and I'm going to add that around the eye. But I spoke about tight curves and how we want to avoid them. This is a really tight curve. So what I do in that situation where I don't want to create a slight corner like I did last time, what I do here is I will take a seam and run a construction seam through the middle. So then you can stitch one side and then the other side and stitch them together. However, what I'm also going to do here is actually line that seam up with this line here, so that just keeps things looking a little tidier. I'll show you what I mean. So I'm actually going to run through the eye on that angle so that it actually straight away captures that seam. It just gives you a tidier finish. So I'm always thinking about removing corners and tight curves, but also aligning those where possible with an existing seam. Hopefully that gives you a little glimpse into the process that I use to go from a sketch to a quilt pattern. I'm sure there are questions. Feel free to send them my way, and then hopefully I can answer them either in the comments or in a future video or blog post. And it will also help me prepare for if I ever do put together a course to teach this more comprehensively to students, including maybe yourself. Thanks for watching.